Bond. James Bond.
Your first experience with a franchise can be a make-or-break moment. I've seen it both establish lifetime fans or turn people off to something for an extended period of time, maybe for the rest of their lives, regardless of whether or not there are better films in the series. For those of us that are already fans, it can be a crucial thing to pick the right first movie for our friends. I've had several chances at this opportunity myself, and it's a thrilling experience whether or not they like the film. However, no one was around to guide me into the James Bond franchise like that, and so I was left to my own devices when I finally sat down to watch a Bond film from beginning to end for the first time. If you haven't guessed the punchline yet, Die Another Day was the first Bond film I saw all the way through. I do remember having a mixed reaction to it at the time, but I continued undaunted, confident that I had just come across one of the lesser films. Sure enough, the subsequent films of License to Kill, The Man with the Golden Gun, and The Spy Who Loved Me went over much better, and I was firmly made a fan. So I get a chuckle every time someone places their first Bond film highly on a ranking list, knowing that I'm one of the outliers that doesn't share that same relationship to my first Bond film. Die Another Day comes towards the bottom of the official films list for me because, quite frankly, this is a very messy film, and there are so many others that, while they may commit some similar high-caliber mistakes, still work a lot better for me. While I've heard this one described as the Batman and Robin of the franchise, I'm not sure I'd go quite that far. I do have some nice things to say about it, and I'll happily sit through this one several times over before I rewatch that movie. Within the Bond fandom, every entry is someone's sincere favorite, which is wonderful actually. I love that someone somewhere has a genuine love for more maligned entries, and my attitude has always been to try to learn from them and see what I'm missing so that I can enjoy it too. My attitude in film critique is never that I'm right and everyone else is wrong. I can definitely understand how someone can appreciate this one, but understanding isn't the same as sharing an opinion. And while I love championing underdogs and trying to help to get rid of some of the vehement air of extreme negativity surrounding entertainment today, I don't think it's possible to love everything equally about a long-running series, and Die Another Day is an example to me of how even the best series has its duds. James Bond is sent to North Korea to assassinate Colonel Moon, a renegade officer with grand ambitions. As he arrives, he is recognized by an informant, which places him in serious jeopardy. While he does seemingly dispatch the colonel, Bond is captured and tortured for 14 months. Out of nowhere, Bond is traded in a prisoner exchange for Zhao, the ruthless right-hand man of Colonel Moon. Upon a conversation with M, Bond realizes he is a pawn in a chess game, most likely being played out by the mysterious informant, and he decides to go after Zhao in order to find out who the person is, but not before M rescinds his 00 status. With the help of a Chinese ally, Bond tracks Zhao to a gene therapy clinic in Cuba, a place that specializes in rewriting the DNA of its clients in order to give them a new lease on life. Bond also encounters a woman named Jinx, an American who takes out the clinic just as Bond recovers some diamonds which link Zhao to a public figure named Gustav Graves, who has recently made a fortune in mining diamonds. Bond must now piece together the pieces of the puzzle that he has: a North Korean terrorist, a British philanthropist, and a possible mole within MI6, and stop them from ensuring the unification of Korea under the wrong hands. Being released in 2002, the 40th anniversary of the series, Die Another Day has some very specific goals in mind. Tackle current world issues with an espionage flair to its story, pay homage to the series' history, solidify the relevance of James Bond in a more modern world, and deliver a slam-bang action-filled adventure that straddles the line between grounded thriller and high-flying spectacle. If this sounds familiar, it's probably because of two reasons. One, Pierce Brosnan has already done a film that I would argue accomplished a lot of this better. And two, 10 years later, another film came along that would do a lot of this as well. I've called Die Another Day the precursor to Skyfall before, but I've never taken much time to fully explain this claim, so let me elaborate a bit on this notion. Both were released as anniversary celebrations with established actors, both who weirdly did their first film with the same director. Both include homages to the series' past, sometimes featuring gadgets. Both question the idea of James Bond still having a place in a post-Cold War world, and both end up delivering a resounding affirmation on the continuing need for 007. Both start their plots with Bond disappearing from the world for a time, coloring the scenario as a symbolic death of the character, with Bond having to be redeemed and reinstated as 007. Both have villains that are deliberate mirrors of Bond. Silva has ties to MI6, much as Miranda Frost does, so both feature villains that were once colleagues of Bond. Both have M making a bad judgment call around Bond, the first dismissing him as useless, and the second ordering a potentially fatal shot on him. Both have part of their plot take place in London, and finally both feature Aston Martins in an action scene that makes use of its built-in gadgets, particularly the machine guns. Some of these comparisons are more obvious than others, while some are quite superficial. However, it does beg the question, if the two films are alarmingly similar, why does one work for most audiences and the other doesn't? My answer is that Die Another Day finishes its thematic goals in the first half. By the time we go to Iceland, Bond has no more interesting character stuff really to deal with, so that second half feels very disconnected to me. Sure, there were some really odd and questionable choices in that first half that herald the near insanity of the second, but the first half has such a grounded feel to its material, and honestly for the early scenes, reminds me a lot of The Living Daylights. This is still the classic cinematic Bond we've seen for 40 years carrying an adventure, and we've seen how that same man can work in the grounded realm of spy thrillers as well as the bombastic festivals that produce some of the series' finest hours. However, trying to do both in the same film is not a good idea, as it's like mixing Thai food with Italian. You have two stylistically different things both trying to be the main event. I really like both, but not on the same plate. As much as I love both Goldfinger and Casino Royale, I wouldn't take Goldfinger himself and make him a central villain in a Craig film, nor would I take a tragic traitor like Vesper and make her a key figure in the Goldfinger story. I suppose that with skilled writers and a fantastic director you could blend the two seamlessly, but that's not what's happening here. Die Another Day starts at one end of the dial and flips to the opposite side with such surprising speed that it gives you whiplash. How does the same film that shows Bond being brutally tortured and abandoned by MI6 also feature CGI windsurfing on a tsunami created by a giant laser beam from a diamond-studded satellite? I think one of the most criminal things this film does is making Bond seem like nothing special among its cast of characters. In a lot of the other films, Bond feels unique, and the supporting characters are generally their own thing. We occasionally have mirrors of Bond in the villain, the leading lady, or the henchman, but never all at once. Die Another Day overdoes this idea. The leading lady is Bond as a female, the lead villain is intentionally crafted to be in Bond's image, and the secondary Bond woman and principal henchman is an accomplished field agent in MI6. Thus, Bond can feel a little lost in the story, and much of the awesomeness about him is emulated by other people, so he feels less significant. If everyone else can do what Bond can, then why are we following him? I don't mind people supporting him and sometimes matching him in ability, but Bond should never feel pointless in his own film. I think that's also partly why most people like the first half. It feels like a proper Bond film focusing on James Bond. In the second half, he becomes amoebic to the story's desires and whims, and he no longer drives it like he does before. Pierce Brosnan has been consistently good in each of his films for me, but much like Sean Connery and Roger Moore before him, there are just some Bond films that even he can't save with a solid performance. I love how Brosnan plays his bitterness at M in the recovery room, the confidence with which he strides through Cuba on his own, and how he plays out the charm with Miranda in Iceland. He can still sell me on the balance like he always has between a suave spy who is the center of attention in a room and someone who will not hesitate to kill in cold blood if needed. However, the film gets out of control under his nose, and so sometimes his performance feels a little tone-deaf. I don't blame this on Brosnan, really. Roger and Sean had similar problems with some of their films. When they weren't sure of what to do, they kept to the variation of the character they established. Pierce continues playing the character as he has before, but because the film goes over the edge in silliness, it's hard to picture this same guy who, in the past, had a fierce confrontation with a former friend, experienced the loss of an old flame, or just last film, had to wrestle with the ghosts of his past, working into this story. There's a dissonance with him in the back half that, quite frankly, sucks, as this ended up being Brosnan's last film. Connery, Moore, and Brosnan all deserved better finales than what they got. In case you're curious, I'm in the camp that loves to think of the video game Everything or Nothing as being the true final Brosnan adventure. I've never liked Jinx, even from the beginning. There's nothing inherently wrong with Bond meeting his match in the opposite sex, but I feel like the best films that do this leave room for both characters to shine. This film feels like they're competing with each other for that spotlight, but not in a fun way. Plus, Jinx has a lot of weird and awkward lines and innuendos to say. She also gets to be the deliverer of one of my 3 least favorite moments in the series, possibly the most cringy line I have ever heard in a Bond film. Halle Berry is a great actress, one of the strongest to have ever been cast in the series, but you wouldn't know it based off of this film. It's a shame that such an actress was wasted on this role. For a lot of reasons, I'm really glad the spin-off with her didn't end up happening. Toby Stephens is both a fine and an odd casting choice to play the villain. It's no secret that this film was mining unused material from Ian Fleming's Moonraker, which is generally considered to be one of, if not the best, of the original novels. Gustav Graves is modeled after Sir Hugo Drax, a foreigner posing as a British citizen who quickly becomes wealthy, builds a device that is both a potential savior for the West and a destructive tool in the wrong hands, frequents a club called Blades, and mirrors Bond. This is a great start for a villain. However, Stephens comes off as petulant and smarmy rather than menacing and charming. This is extremely odd to me, given that Stephens is a Shakespearean-trained actor, has appeared in many things that I really liked him in, and has even portrayed Bond several times in radio play adaptations of the Fleming works. In this film, some of his line readings seem hollow and cheap, like his heart wasn't in it. At other times, he delivers his lines as convincingly as a Power Rangers villain. I'm not sure if this was a directing problem on Lee Tamahori's part, or if Stephens buckled under the pressure and delivered a subpar performance. Regardless, this is a character that doesn't work for me, and so I'm in concordance with most of the rest of the fandom about placing him towards the bottom of the villains roster. I much prefer Will Young Lee's performance in the pre-credits sequence and think he may have made for a better villain. Zhao and Miranda Frost fare a bit better, however they too are tainted by the film's tonal degeneration. Zhao begins as more of a physical presence, someone you don't mess with. And I like the idea of Bond giving him a physical deformity so there's a personal reason for Zhao to hate him. However, I think once the movie has revealed Gustav as our villain, the story seems to have no more use for Zhao and thus he fades into the background. Also, I think the look he has later with the bald head and the diamonds undermines his threat because it comes off as silly to me. Miranda Frost follows in the footsteps of Xenia and Fiona Volpe, being more of a femme fatale. I like her striking look, I love a lot of her acting choices, and she seems to be one of the performers most comfortable with her part. She has a confidence and a glare that would silence anyone other than Bond. But there are a few glaring issues with her. The first is making her the informant. The story feels like it's cheating because she's not someone we would have considered because she wasn't introduced until much later in the film. We are initially suspicious of her, we are then supposed to be comforted by her being a deep cover operative for MI6, and then the twist goes back to making her a bad guy. It's a really weird progression given that she's supposed to be central to the first half of the film's story and we weren't even aware of her existence until 50 minutes in. Second, she loses a lot of her own drive once she is revealed to be working for Graves for real, so she just becomes a pawn on a chessboard rather than an integral part of the entourage like Fiona and Mayday were. Finally, her death is cringeworthy. From the clunky setup to the actual line from Jinx to the fact that it's a supposed fencing prodigy that is taken down in such an anticlimactic way, it's a shame. I'd still consider her a high point of the film because of the positive things I stated earlier. Even the film's supporting cast suffers. Judi Dench does nothing wrong with the part, and her 2 scenes with Bond are some of my favorites in the film. But the choice to ship her out to various locations when she could have just as easily been integrated through a video call is bothersome. Plus, I wish I knew why she reversed her mind on Bond's usefulness so fast. Yes, he makes progress on an investigation on Graves, but I'm not sure why she didn't consider that Bond is her best agent, and thus probably would be the one to make progress on a stagnant case. This doubly hurts because it undermines one of the core themes of the film, Bond's place in a modern world. He starts the film being abandoned and left to rot because MI6 thinks he screwed up his assignment. When Bond comes back with information on Graves, This does nothing to prove he didn't screw up, and M still decides he's become useful again. This beat would have worked so much better if it occurred after Iceland, once Bond has proven that Miranda sold him out and uncovers a plot that MI6 really had no knowledge about. So you can see him rectifying something substantial, and now M would have a solid basis for trusting Bond again. John Cleese gets a fine scene as Q here, and I will admit that seeing a lot of the old gadgets again, and the progression of Bond calling him first quartermaster and then awarding him the title of Q makes me smile. I'm of two minds on the VR glasses. On the one hand, we get a fun sequence where Bond saves MI6 from a terrorist attack. Plus, Bond voices his dislike at this method of training, preferring the old firing range, which feels like a very Fleming-esque touch. On the other hand, the VR goggles don't mean much beyond letting us see fake scenarios, so it takes a bit of the thrill out of the MI6 attack. Also, it gives us what is, for my money, the worst Moneypenny scene in any of the Bond films. I also have a real issue with Falco, the NSA superior. Michael Madsen is a fine actor, but the character makes a move that confounds me. He calls M, berating her for not keeping Bond under control, and specifically blaming Bond for torching the clinic. However, Jinx is the one who deliberately blew up part of the building, which I assume was not an initiative that she took of her own accord, but it was instead part of her mission, probably given by Falco himself. When asked about this by M later, Falco claims it was a good move, citing the mole at MI6, which I doubt he knew about, so this just seems like him covering his own butt for a decision that makes no sense to me. Because of that, and Madsen not really contributing anything positive to the film, he stands as one of my least favorite allies in the series, if you would even call him that. Vlad makes little impression on me. Mr. Kill has a pretty groan-worthy introduction, and his fight scene with Bond doesn't move the dial for me. Mr. Chang, a replacement for Wei Lin, is fine, but he's out of the film rather quickly, and so I forget he was even in it by the end. I do like Emilio Echevarria as Raul. He has some nice interplay with Bond, and there's something about his delivery of lines that I really like. But my favorite supporting character is General Moon, played by Kenneth Sang. A more peace-driven Korean leader, he reminds me a lot of General Gogol from earlier films. Cubby Broccoli always had a thing about making sure that a nation was not villainized completely, and so he always made sure to add in some more fair Russians. General Moon feels like a nod to that, with his scene with Bond on the bridge being my favorite acting moment of the entire film. I can somewhat understand MGM deciding to go for a different director than Michael Apt did for this one, but I'm not sure Lee Tamahori had a solid vision on how to handle Bond or the story he was given. I sometimes have trouble following this plot, and there's very little uniquely positive about his take on Bond. One of the film's biggest problems is getting through all of its interesting character material well before we move on to the final action scenes. It's like Tamahori was terrified we were going to be distracted by thinking about the film's meat while the biggest spectacles were happening before our eyes, and he didn't want our minds elsewhere. This strikes me as a bit insulting to assume that your audience's attention span is so narrow that we can't divide our focus between your story and action. It actually convinces me that he treats action scenes like most bad directors, something that is detached from the story and not helping to progress anything substantial. If you want an example of how a great film should handle action scenes, go watch Wrath of Khan. Every photon torpedo hit means something. Every decision the characters make either changes the situation or reveals something about themselves. I really don't mind action scenes that are just there to add excitement, as long as there is something afterwards to wash down the cotton candy. But other than Graves killing his own father, there's so little substance to the last 30 minutes of the film that my eyes start to glaze over. If that wasn't enough criticism for Tamahori, I want to address another elephant in the room: the editing. My goodness, the sped up footage in combination with the slow-mo incredibly dates the film. I've never liked this style for a narrative feature. It feels far better suited to something that places visuals first, like a music video, so the whole gimmick comes off as a cheap way to add excitement to the film. It really doesn't need it. You have a solid cast, a story that starts off with some intriguing ideas, and some fine concepts for your action sequences. Isn't that enough for you to have faith that your audience will be sufficiently entertained that you don't need these trends? I'm placing the blame partly on Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, as I know they were terrified that other contemporary action films were surpassing them in the marketplace and with the audience. But I'm placing most of the blame on Tamahori. Editors should take their cue from their director and adapt to their wants and desires for a project. I've seen Christian Wagner's work on plenty of other action films, and while he makes some of the same mistakes on those as well, There's also plenty where you can tell that the editing is particularly helpful in accomplishing the film's goals. Hindsight being what it is, it's easy to say this was a terrible creative decision, but I can tell you that I never gelled with this choice back in 2004 when I saw the film for the first time, so I don't think this is something that couldn't have occurred to the filmmakers. The music is generally fine, though far too heavy on the electronics for my taste. I appreciate that David Arnold once again made sure he had a theme song to melodically work in throughout the film, which was called I Will Return. This melody can be heard throughout many of the action scenes and in some softer moments like the piano riff that plays when Bond meets Peaceful Fountains of Desire. Fun fact, this song actually featured lyrics that were later reused for No Good About Goodbye, a song that Arnold wrote for Shirley Bassey and one that many are convinced was a rejected theme song for Quantum of Solace. There's also a fun remix of the James Bond theme done by Paul Oakenfold that was used for the promo materials, much like the GoldenEye trailer music and the Moby remix done for Tomorrow Never Dies. Yet the main thing musically that anyone talks about for the film is the Madonna title song, and this is either a song you love or you hate. Madonna is an interesting choice for the film, and I have no doubt she would have done a fair song back in the 1980s. For me, I think the direction to go techno came from the same notion as the editing, and it results in the same outcome. Instead of modernizing the series and giving it an edge, it makes it a product of the time in a bad way. The overproduced electronic dance pop of the early 2000s has its place, but I would argue it's not in front of a James Bond film. Die Another Day is replete with references to past official Bond films. In fact, I found a reference or connection with every one of them, with many being represented more than once. I don't mind the idea of including references, as it can be a small bit of fun fan service or can enhance your appreciation of a film or its story. For example, Elektra being similar to Tracy in the last film gave me a greater appreciation for that character. Q giving Bond some more of the mundane gadgets from past films in Skyfall is a fun tip of the hat that makes me smile. However, the choice to include many references to every other Bond film becomes intrusive because it turns the movie into a game of I Spy. At a certain point, they feel obligatory, and I spend more of my time trying to spot them than I do thinking about the story or characters, which taking a viewer's mind off of those for an extended period of time is rarely a good thing, like I talked about earlier. Finally, I don't want to make this review nothing but negative remarks. As I did say towards the beginning, I have some nice things to say, and I'd like to prove that more beyond some of the things I've already mentioned. However, this next section will probably be a bit more scattered than my previous points. The bullet coming down the gun barrel is corny, but I adore the version of the Bond theme that plays underneath it. Its rich guitar makes for a rocking groove. It's easy to forget there's a really cool surfing sequence that opens the film. Maybe it's just me, but I think this is a fine way to begin the story, and is a little more interesting than just having Bond parachute his way into hostile territory. One of the references I think really works is Bond revealing dry clothes under a wetsuit. I buy that he does this somewhat regularly, and it's a fun callback. The hovercraft sequence is in the same vein as the boat chase from The World Is Not Enough, and is ridiculously fun, though never so high-octane as to break the reality of the film for me. In fact, for every poor action scene here, there's another that's quite good. The ice chase is a little marred by the editing, but it features some great bits, such as Bond flipping the car back over with an ejector seat. I love getting a bona fide sword fight into a Bond film, and I'm a little surprised we've done very little of this in the series before. I'm a big fan of the Aston Martin V12 Vanquish. It's an amazing looking car, has a lot of the great vehicle gadgets of the past, and has a unique one to its name. I know the invisibility is too far for some people, and I would agree that it is out of place with the first half, but given how the film shifts gears so suddenly, I'll take all the fun I can get. It is more of a roadshow stunt than something that actually exists in the form it is presented with. But hey, so were a number of car stunts in the series, and besides, if we can have a car that goes underwater and another that can fly, why not allow for an invisible car? As I've said before with this series, I will take entertainment over realism. While I'm not a big fan of the execution, I love the idea of using the titles to progress the story, and there's still some great imagery throughout the sequence. In the midst of so many references to past films, I'm glad someone somewhere made the decision to put in the book Birds of the West Indies so that we could get a nod to where Bond's name came from. When other reviewers talk about Die Another Day, a lot are quick to mention that the first half is really good while the second half is terrible. I've always thought it was a bit more complicated than that, as the first half contains some really terrible things, and the second half has a few redeeming qualities for me. While that first half does contain Bond being tortured, becoming a rogue agent, and features some intriguing questions, it also contains Madonna's title song, Bond stopping his heart at will and restarting it again, and the start of the groan-worthy lines with Jinx. While the second half contains CG windsurfing and an over-the-top finale, it also has a solid car chase on ice and Miranda Frost. Therefore, I think this is a movie that is at war with itself, and in the process, it dies by its own actions. I don't think one single thing killed this movie, but that it was a death by 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. I'll still happily watch large chunks of the film, but I've always come away disappointed when I get to the end credits. I'm very grateful that my 11-year-old self wasn't discouraged by the initial mixed reaction he had, and instead went on to view a few more before deciding the whole series wasn't for him. I'll still defend various aspects of this film, and I wouldn't describe it as being anywhere close to the worst thing I've ever seen, but there's no way around it. Almost every other official Bond film is more interesting, more exciting, or comes together in a more cohesive way, and while I'll still rewatch it on occasion, Die Another Day is usually one of the last I'll think about returning to. The film was initially received somewhat positively, and it was the highest grossing Bond film unadjusted for inflation at the time. I think most everyone, even if they didn't like it, expected there to be a fifth film from Brosnan. Unbeknownst to us, this movie took a huge toll on the filmmakers. While they weren't exactly dissatisfied with their efforts, the producers realized that their current trajectory for the series wasn't going to be very sustainable for the long term, and with several action films making a bigger splash with audiences and critics, the time was perhaps right for a reinvention of the character. This resulted in perhaps the riskiest move the franchise had ever taken, even bigger than getting the series started all the way back in 1962, and no one knew if it was a move that would cement the series for decades to come, or if it would be the final nail in the coffin for the legendary super spy. Pierce Brosnan ultimately got a raw end of the deal when it came to James Bond. Once thought of as the perfect man for the job, Pierce lost the role initially due to a contract dispute, got the part again 8 years later, and then was unseated before he felt ready to move on. Perhaps more so than any of the other actors, I think Pierce is the most justified in having mixed feelings about the part. He wasn't released from the role due to anything he did wrong or because the films weren't making money. He was released because of a creative decision. While I think this decision injected a lot of life back into the series and reinvigorated the character with audiences, it still casts a shadow on everything Brosnan did with the role, and it has led to some wild and unsubstantiated claims that he was being seen as the reason the films never caught on with the public after GoldenEye, or that the filmmakers were unhappy and fired him. To my mind, Pierce is the spitting image of James Bond, and no other actor has sold me on all aspects of the character as well as he did. I fully believe that when portrayed by Brosnan, Bond is charming, bold, reserved, cultured, funny, dangerous, and romantic. His first performance in GoldenEye is one of the best Bond performances of the series to my mind, and while his interpretation naturally shifted over time, it was always one that worked with me. He was born to play the role, and I would have been very happy to see him do one or two more. He cared about the part, and I get the sense it meant more to him personally than any of the other actors. His era brings both joy and sadness to me, much as I get with Timothy Dalton's, and it's a time I'm always happy to revisit. Thankfully, his Bond has participated in some terrific video games, and thus if I want to prolong my time with him, I can happily count the original adventures of Nightfire and Everything or Nothing as part of his run. Regardless, Pierce remains my personal favorite actor to have ever played the part, and I can take comfort that he had at least 3 films that all struck some sort of chord with me. While there are better actors who have played the part before and after, when it comes to James Bond for me, nobody does it better than Pierce Brosnan.